Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Workplace Change webinar. Today's webinar is The World as We Know It Has Changed and Chaos Has Ensued. How do you strategize for the workplace and the workforce of the future? So before we jump into the actual presentation itself, I want to thank you again for joining us for the webinar. And I also want to invite you into the chat, right? So go ahead and open up that chat box because I want for this to be as interactive as possible. We want you to wrestle with the things that we're presenting to you today. We want for there to be engagement, for you to explore, and basically try things on for size for your particular ecosystem. So if you're with us, jump in the chat, let us know who you are, let us know what organization you're with. And Moya and Katie, raise your hands, ladies, so they can see who you are. Lady in the black shirt is Katie, and the lady in the white shirt with the darker hair is Moya. They will be manning the chat, and at the end of John Topogna's presentation, Moya is going to be asking questions from the chat, so make sure you jump in there, and as John is presenting, throw your question into the chat, and then Katie is going to be asking questions from my component of the presentation, all right? So again, we want this to be interactive. Jump in the chat, let us know that you're here. Without further ado, we're going to jump into the actual presentation itself. Joining us today is John Topogna. I've known John for years, since my PBA days. John is a renowned public policy expert. I mean, I think he's probably, consulted with every government entity and large corporation in the region. And his firm, ECONorthwest, is the leading economy, finance, and public policy firm in the region. So without further ado, welcome, John.
Thank you, Sorelda. I'm going to try to keep up with this energy. Love the start, the music, and have some troubling news to share as the title of this webinar gives a hint. We are in a world of chaos. Literally, the last time I gave the next to the last time I gave an in-person presentation on the economy, the unemployment rate was at 3.5%, and we were in the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. So talk about being whipsawed. We really have been. Why don't we go ahead, Hannah, we'll go ahead and start moving through the deck. This is the title, the outlook, as the economy begins to reopening. And so I'm going to settle on this slide for just a moment and discuss what economists are sort of describing as three phases of the economy. The one that we are living through and just about to conclude, especially in the Portland metropolitan area, is this shutdown period. It was literally the only time in the history of the United States where we have intentionally shut down, for all intents and purposes, put the economy into a coma to save itself. Never done anything like that before, hopefully never have to do anything like it again. And we are literally today and this weekend in those very initial stages of this reopening period. And you're beginning to get a sense of what that means. So a number of parts of our economy that were completely shut down have the ability to invite people back in to some extent, but that's going to be an interesting dance, given that the virus is still with us and it's still in the background. I've got a timeline on there saying that, we're 3 to 12 months. I mean, that really should just say until we get a vaccine and the coast is clear and this virus is eradicated. We're going to be living in this kind of middle ground of reopening, and it's going to take a long time. And then finally, when we've knocked out this coronavirus and we know it's nowhere around us, then we can really start to focus on a recovery like the ones that we've thought about in the past. So that's just organization to give you a sense of where we are. So let's go now to the questions for this presentation. Hannah, on the next slide. First, just where do we stand today? Second, who's calling the shots right now, governors or the virus? And then the third question, what is the economic outlook as we think about late this year and early into next year and thereafter with the virus still sitting in the background? We'll go lean into this first question. Where do we stand? Hannah, we'll go to the next slide. that just has a question, so we'll go ahead and move on into the substance. You can just barely see it there on the right-hand side. That's unemployment in the United States. Number of people that are currently under insured unemployment claims, and so clearly that that's going back to 1968. You can see that line. It looks like a borderline up on the right-hand side. We have seen nothing like it. These are the highest rates of unemployment since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The good news, I will say, hopefully good news, is that we don't expect them to be as protracted or as long as the Great Depression. But in terms of this spike, the number of people and the share of people who are unemployed are similar to those rates that we saw back in the 1930s, 90 years ago. Go to the next slide. Where has this hit? Ground zero of this are all of those industries that sort of encourage and are economically revolve around social interaction. And so at the very top of that list are the leisure and hospitality sector. So everything that that has been closed. Restaurants and theaters and bars and concert venues and sporting arenas and anything to do with sort of tourism and air travel. So on the left-hand side there, you can see the millions of numbers of jobs that have been lost in that area. And then on the right-hand side is the share of employment in that sector relative to, so it's the unemployment relative to the employment in February of 2020. So you're not only big numbers in leisure and hospitality, as you can see in terms of millions of jobs lost, but also almost half of all jobs that existed in February don't exist today, hopefully only temporarily. The other interesting thing here is just sort of move down all these other sectors. Until you get down into financial activities and the federal government, just about everybody, every sector has been touched to some degree. Look at those percentages, getting up to 10%. In most of those cases, retail trade higher. I think a bit of a surprise, if you just look at the millions of jobs lost on the left-hand side, is how high healthcare and social assistance is. As we came into this, you were probably thinking, boy, the healthcare sector is going to be real busy. The hospitals are going to be filled, and there's going to be a lot of healthcare workers. Well, there's a whole half or more of the healthcare side of the shop that is elective procedures, routine physicals, elective surgeries, other kinds of check-ins that can be put off. And they were, and consequently, hospitals and physician groups and others laid people off during this period. So an awful lot of people on the unemployment rolls. We'll go to the next slide now. Here's how New York Times did a nice piece this week, sort of breaking out unemployment in a few different dimensions. Here you can see the share of people with earnings at certain levels, what share of those individuals are newly unemployed and how has that grown since the beginning of March. That line at the top is saying what share of people who were employed in February are newly unemployed if they were earning less than $50,000 a year. You can see this is all very disproportionately hitting on low-income workers. And again, that makes intuitive sense given how much of the leisure and hospitality sector was in the middle of that. An awful lot of lower paid work in restaurants, in hotels, and in other retail establishments. Certainly the higher incomes were not missed. You can see reductions there as well. You've got architecture firms that are laying off people because work is slowing down. You have attorneys and paralegals, et cetera, that probably have some temporary layoffs because the court systems can't move and function in the same way that they have traditionally. They don't do depositions by Zoom. So legal activity has slowed down. Just virtually every sector that you come across has some story. The manufacturing sector needed more social distancing inside those factory floors. You clearly saw in the middle part of the country where food processing, there wasn't enough social distancing going on, and we had a tremendous amount of viral activity going on in those meat packing plants in Iowa and South Dakota and the like. Go to the next slide. We'll see this now disproportionately hitting women relative to men. That's a big story, and again, tied to the sectors that were at the center of this. One more, and we'll look at race and ethnicity. Interesting, if you went back a couple of weeks ago, this was hitting races in a relatively kind of equitable way a couple of weeks ago. That does make some intuitive sense if you think about all of the narratives of essential and frontline workers being, in some cases, disproportionately people of color who are in grocers and maybe some of the nursing homes and support care places that have stayed open. Those individuals who are continuing to be employed are in sometimes dangerous situations or putting themselves at health risk for continuing to work. This is the other side of the coin. And it's essentially showing that as of a couple of weeks ago, kind of equitable job loss across races, but now it's starting to open up a little bit, as you can see, with the rates for Black and Hispanic employees starting to pull away from those for whites. So next slide. Part of this story of where we stand now and how folks are doing ties to the federal intervention. The CARES Act, which was the sort of the centerpiece of what has been 3 or 4 different rounds of federal intervention. It is and will be the biggest relief package in the history of the United States. It dwarfs the initial response of the New Deal. It dwarfs what the Obama administration put out in 2009. This just summarizes the sort of the major buckets of the CARES Act in terms of dollars. This is the $2.2 trillion attempt. $560 billion of that going to individuals. That was split up roughly half and half between money that went out in those $1,200 checks that, close to 90% of households in the United States and in Oregon received at some level, and the other half being amplified and expanded unemployment insurance, both in terms of extra payments, and I'll be showing a chart on that for anybody who is unemployed, but also extending unemployment insurance into places and jobs that weren't originally covered by unemployment insurance, like Lyft drivers and other gig economy workers, et cetera. I'm not going to talk about all of these in the big corporations. You've got, you can delay your payroll taxes, and there are some tax breaks in that big corporation bucket, bailouts of the airline sector and the cruise ship sector. Small businesses, a large number of businesses, small businesses received the Paycheck Protection Program. If you're working with a small business, pretty high likelihood that they are trying to navigate and work through that. And we can go into that in more detail in question and answer period if you would like. Just touching lastly, the state and local government bucket. Most states and local government have received a check from the federal government. They can't use it just to simply backfill their revenue losses, which are huge, but they can use it to help reimburse themselves for extraordinary expenses that they have incurred because of their attempt to fight the virus. Oregon, the state of Oregon, for example, at the state level has received $1.4 billion that they have to spend before December 31st of this year. I don't believe much of that money has been deployed yet, so they'll have to think about how to do that. That's an overview there. So we'll move just a quick discussion here of that unemployment on the next slide. This is what it looks like in Oregon. So you can sort of see the annual income that the unemployed person was earning before they were laid off. Let's just take a look at somebody that was at $22,500. In Oregon, they would have received $281, replacing about 65% of their wages. But then this $600 a week federal payment comes in. And if you take the combination of those two, they, for a period of time, are getting unemployment insurance payments that are equal to twice what they were earning. So that very intentional and a very progressive policy. You get up to the sort of $62,000 level, $500, and you've got the $600 a week payment, roughly equal to what they would be receiving in traditional state unemployment insurance. And so they're made whole. They're at a 100% replacement. And that lasts, that program lasts until the end of July. So let's move on. My overarching comment on the CARES Act is it was a massive response. It passed the US Senate 96-0. That meant that Bernie Sanders and Mitch McConnell agreed on a package, which is pretty mind-bending. And it did sort of fit the bill for if you thought the economic damage was going to take place between March and the end of July. It sort of made many people whole. It left some people out, but it made a lot of people whole during that period of time. As I'll talk about later, as this economic pain continues, that CARES Act is not going to cover sort of August and thereafter. Next questions. Who's calling the shots? The governors or the virus? So I'll step through this. Go to the next slide there, Hannah. If there were one slide that summarizes my concerns about the economy, it's this one. A poll by a local regional public opinion pollster, DHM Research, asked folks, it was in the middle of last month, how comfortable are you engaging in these activities in the public? How many months from now would you be comfortable? Getting a haircut, 2 months from now. Dining in a restaurant, 3. Go to a shopping mall, 4. Travel on an airplane, 5. Attend a major sporting event, 6. So, excuse me. So the underlying issue here is, in some respects, what the governor does in terms of regulation and saying you can open really doesn't matter until people start answering these questions differently. If the restaurant's open, but people say, boy, I'm not ready to go to a restaurant until August, well, the restaurants aren't making any money. So this is the challenge, and I'll show you some more slides that sort of double down on this. And so we'll move through this next section relatively quickly. This is just showing a little bit of a rebound. If you look at open table data across the country, Texas and Georgia and Florida are starting to see coming off of the floor a little bit of activity, but you can see that overall US average is still down 90% relative to what we saw in January and February. We go to the next slide. Not good news for the airlines. Here's TSA passages. The blue line is 2019. The red line is 2020. If you stare at this really closely, you can see it's starting to come off that floor of a 93% decline, but not very quickly. The question for all of you is, when are you going to be ready to sit in the middle seat of an airplane? Next slide. Here's, this is interesting data that came out of Harvard and this outfit called Opportunity Insights. There's a great website. They update it in real time. But what it does is it tracks, in this case, consumer spending in different areas in real time, and sort of shows, if you look at that April 30th, when Georgia opened up in a very sort of public national way, you can follow consumer spending after that. And you can see that the green line, which is the total, it's edging up a little bit, but it's not like the economy reopened and all of a sudden consumers are spending all kinds of money. You can see that the healthcare sector picked up a little bit, and the entertainment recreation sector, it picked up some too, but there's an awful long way left to get back to where they were. Another way of looking at this or thinking about it on the next slide is just do a comparison between Minnesota and South Dakota. One of those states shut down, the other one never did, but their spending looks the same. So the fact that South Dakota left their economy open didn't mean that South Dakotans all went out and, you know, hung out in bars and ate in restaurants. They knew the virus was out there and they were behaving accordingly. Next slide is just the quote from the makers of this: the decline in economic activity, consumer spending, number of small businesses open, and employment occurred in most cases before states shut down. Moreover, we show that recent policies ending these shutdowns in certain states, such as Georgia and South Carolina, have not been associated with the significant increases in economic activity. These findings suggest that the primary barrier to economic activity is the threat of COVID-19 itself, as opposed to legislated economic shutdowns. So, you know, the fight going forward in terms of how robust this economy is going to be over the course of the rest of this reopening period has to do with our effectiveness in fighting this virus and getting people comfortable that we're on top of it and that they're safe if they walk into a restaurant or into a bar or into a theater. So that's that piece. We'll move on here. So how do we put this all together, and what are economists thinking as they look out over the course of the next 18 months or so? That's the question here. We'll go to the next slide. Here's the Congressional Budget Office. So we're at that peak now. Unemployment, sort of official unemployment, at about 16% by their numbers. You can see that coming down. They're basically looking at unemployment in the end of 2020, probably in the very low teens, sort of around 11 or 12. And then by the end of 2021, it will trend down to probably 8 or 9%, which is sort of around the highest rates that we saw in the Great Recession. So we're in this very deep, Great Depression-like spot right now. We will trend down and improve to similar levels of unemployment that we saw in the Great Recession. Next slide. Something to pay attention to as you think about and read in the popular press about unemployment rates and how many people are really impacted by this. The orange bars are what what the Congressional Budget Office thinks you are going to see in terms of an official unemployment rate as that goes forward in the 2021 through the end of 2021. But then that brown or darker color are the additional sort of share of individuals who just drop out of the labor force and give up. So they're not actively looking for work. They're not applying for unemployment compensation, that kind of thing. The situation is dire enough that they've given up. So relative to where we were standing in February, you might see an unemployment rate that looks like 18% or so in the next few days in the newspaper, but really relative to the share of people that were employed back in February, it's more like a loss of employment that's a 25% unemployment rate, because you just had people get out and give up on the labor market altogether. So that just gives you a flavor of the severity. We'll go to the next slide. Here's, Oregon's, I'm just pulling into Oregon's data here because they really do have one of the best economic forecasting teams in the country, and you see them get picked up nationally in some of their commentary. This chart was just released on on the 20th, when they released their official state forecast, you can see this red line is their recovery period. And, employment percentage is going down 20% where we are right now. And then they're calling this sort of a square root recovery. It'll pop up back to a sort of a 12% reduction, and then slowly sort of come back. And they see employment levels that we saw in February of this year not recovering until 4 years from now. So getting that employment level back to February 4 years from now. Now that's sooner. You can see that that's compared to other recessions. The Great Recession, it took us 7 years to get back. That one that says 2007. So a deeper downturn, but hopefully a sharper rebound. And the reason for that is that there really wasn't anything fundamentally wrong with the economy itself when it went into recession. It was an external pandemic that led us to, in a regulatory fashion, shut the economy down intentionally, put it in a coma. And so hopefully it recovers more quickly, but in this case, more quickly is 4 years. So that's the outlook. And I think we end here with some takeaways on the last slide. Unemployment rates are at their highest level since the Great Depression. You will hear that. But put a little asterisk there. When the unemployment hit 25% in the Great Depression, it was because there were huge fundamental flaws in the underlying economy that had to be worked out. In this case, that doesn't exist. We just need to beat this virus. The leisure and hospitality and tourism sectors are going to continue to struggle throughout this reopening period. The restaurants will open, but as you know, when you go in there, you're going to have to be 6 feet apart. That means they can't serve nearly as many people as they traditionally do. Think of that for theaters, think of it for football games or anything else. It's just going to be a struggle until we get the vaccine and it's deployed. and that leads me into that next point, which is the economy is not going to truly enter a recovery stage until the virus is fully eradicated. And the last point is that absent more federal intervention, we'd be in trouble. The Federal CARES Act that was passed, roughly, it was $2.2 trillion, but we've spent about $3 trillion in all the various phases of this. That has been a powerful, proportionate to the pain infusion of money that is really intended to work until about the end of this July. And then, from there and thereafter, we're going to need more federal intervention on Congress's side. So with that, it's a terrible way to start a 3-day weekend, but I'm open to questions.
Well, I want to start by saying thank you, John. I started the presentation off, the webinar off, with the song by Taylor Swift, Shake It Off, because, I knew it was going to be tough. I talked to you before we had this presentation, and I wanted to prep people with an inclination to shake it off for the weekend, but the realities are quite stark when you really look at the details of what's happening around us. So thank you for an overview of where we are in this crisis and kind of what the forecast is for us to get out of it, the timeline associated with that. Moya, do we have any questions in the chat?
We do. Molly asked, it's about freelancers. They used to cover 2 seasonal peaks. Will freelancers who take up work with us for 8 to 10 weeks lose their ability to receive unemployment benefits? We have some freelance contractors that we've been working with for years, and I want to understand a little bit more about their situation so we can handle this situation with as much care as possible.
Yeah, no, that is a great question, and one that I would really have to turn you back. There's so many little intricate details to the CARES Act in different pieces. Some of these freelancers may have been able to apply to the Paycheck Protection Program. and may or may not be aware of that. So absolutely, everybody who's in one of those loose spaces, sort of between an independent contractor and a small business, et cetera, really needs to investigate. There seems to be a lifeboat out there for most, but you got to figure out which one it is.
Right. Were there any other questions?
That was it for now.
Okay. All right. Well, John, thanks again. Again, the reality is nuanced, and there are a great deal of details to pay attention to, and I appreciate you sharing those details with us, your expertise with us. If additional panelists, if you have questions as we continue through this presentation, we're going to now get into some of the workplace dynamics as in response to the information that John supplied us with. But if additional questions pop into your mind, John is going to be with us for the next 30 minutes, so we can also grab additional questions for John at the end of my portion of the presentation. So when I thought about the information that John was sharing, right, I'm like, man, this is bleak. This is tough to process. And then it took me to a place in my mind of, my own personal childhood. So I grew up poor. I grew up in housing projects in Michigan. I grew up with a lot of, difficult times and despair all around, but there were still moments and opportunities for beauty to present itself and optimism to present itself. And so I wanted to start my portion of the conversation off with just a recognition that this is challenging, right? But we will come out on the other side of this, right? And while we're currently in this moment of difficulty, we should start to try to practice exercising our muscle of kind of dreaming and hoping, right? And that's a muscle that I learned to, that I developed over time just throughout my childhood of like, yeah, I can be stuck in this moment of negativity, or I can figure out how do I still thrive and find opportunities even within and amid a crisis and drama and stress or whatever the thing is. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. When I think about the workforce, when I think about the workplace, I think about opportunities and the opportunity to reimagine what's possible. So let's go to our next slide. The workforce and the workplace will have to change as a result of the COVID crisis. This is a reality. This is a fact that a lot of people are currently grappling with, that a lot of people are currently trying to tackle and process right now, right? And so I'm going to share with you kind of the three areas as you start to reimagine what will it take to survive this crisis. These are the three areas from a workplace standpoint that I think you should explore. Number one is culture, number two is financial solvency, and number three is organizational design. So those are the three particular areas that I'm going to focus on today, starting out with organizational culture to begin with. And when it comes to organizational culture, we're going to talk about awareness, like being aware of what your current culture is and how you can become aware of what your current culture is. Defining what you want your future culture to be, right? What's your future state what is the future state of your culture? And then the leadership attributes required to get you to that future state, right? And then kind of a plan of action at each phase of the process. So let's go to the next slide. But I want to kind of ground us in what the definition of culture is to begin with, right? Organizational culture is the value and behavior that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of a business. Said another way, it's the way people act or behave and the way you feel as a member of that ecosystem, right? We have all probably experienced organizational cultures where we felt stressed or we felt super excited and empowered and encouraged to come into work every single day, right? We feel energized, welcomed, excluded. That's company culture, right? And that company culture will either give you what you need to endure and weather this storm, or it'll take the wind from your sails, making it very hard for you to figure out how to tuck and roll and how to be nimble and responsive to the new opportunities and demands that are presented before you. So the thing that I want for us to talk about right now is what makes up a company culture, right? As you're exploring what your current company culture is, These are the 6 areas that make up a company culture. Number 1, your vision. Do people understand what you're trying to accomplish? Do you have a vision? Have you shared the vision with other people? Right? And I know that vision's had to pivot. My team can attest to this, how many times I've said, oh my gosh, all my dreams, all my plans have changed. Where are we to go now? Right? But you have to continue to make them aware of what your vision is. It's really important. That creates culture. Values, right? What are your company corporate values? I have one client, and their philosophy is kind of to serve with love. Right? And they try to embody that. You see them talking about serving with love as it pertains to managing others, as it pertains to how they serve their customers, as it pertains to everything that they do, right? That's a cornerstone value for them that they bake into and hardwire into all that they do. Does your company have a set of values? Is it integrity? Is it respect? Is it high quality? What is it? And do your people know what it is? And then there's the practices that come along with it. Are you living out those values? Now, we've all seen some folks that have got some values, and it's like, I don't see you living into those values on a day-to-day cadence at all, right? So we definitely want to also make sure that the people in your organization, particularly leadership, are demonstrating those values and their commitment to those values day in and day out, even and especially when times get hard and tough. The people. Right? People establish your culture. Is it a homogenous environment? Is it all women? Is it all like, do people walk in and feel like it's an inclusive and inviting environment, right? So your recruitment policies, your people practices, how flexible are you? Do people feel respected? Do they feel supported? How do the human beings in your organization feel about being in your organization? And what's the makeup? Narrative is huge. And a lot of people sleep on the importance of narrative. And that is how people talk about your company. In the company, right? As well as outside of the company. And by the way, your biggest campaigners, your biggest billboard are the people who work in your company and them going out and talking about their experience in your company. That becomes your narrative. That becomes people saying, I want to go and actually buy a shirt from that place or buy a burger from that place, right? This directly impacts your company culture. How people inside and outside of your company talk about your company. No matter what your values are, no matter any of those things, how people talk about you matters. And then place. Now, I want to pause in place just a little bit, right? Because place is evolving, right? The kind of energy you establish in the place, the kind of mood you set, right? You come into my Zoom. I tell people when you come to our webinar, you're coming into my home. This is the kind of energy I like to establish. This is the vibe I like to set. Well, the same thing occurs when you walk into my brick and mortar. Well, right now, space has changed. Space has become more virtual, right? And you have to start asking yourself, how do you establish a spatial culture when you're not all together? What does that look like? What does that feel like? So these are the things that establish and set your company culture. And these are the things that I want you to play with as we move to the next slide, Hannah. As we move to the next slide about like, what is your culture? Do you know what your culture is right now? Right. So as you are taking a moment to think about what your future state looks like, right, you have to reflect on your current state, because those are the things that have to be tweaked. And there are a lot of people who feel like your current company culture is great. Okay, wonderful. How do you sustain it, given the fact that John just told us that COVID is not going to last for 3 months? It's going to last for, 12 to 18 months. And given that reality, our current reality, how do you preserve your healthy culture? And furthermore, if you don't think that your culture is as healthy as you want it to be, as it should be, as it could be, what can you do right now to intentionally redesign, rebuild, refine your current work culture? Your culture is the bedrock of your success. And I can't say it enough, right? So use the responses from the prompts from the previous slide, the culture awareness slide, to understand your current culture, and then write down, actually physically write down what you want your responses to be. Current state, future state. That's the action I want you to take, gang, okay? Because right now is the time. Right now in the time of crisis. Right now when the workforce is looking to be led. They need to be led. We need desperately sound, rational, reasonable leaders. We need leaders who you can trust and be confident in what they say, who have integrity, who are going to point you in the right direction. That's critically important. It's always important, but it's especially important during a crisis when people are looking to you to be honest and real with them. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And then the last culture piece is leadership. Your leadership will make, or your leadership will break you. I can't say it enough, right? Your leaders are the single most important component of establishing a healthy culture because their behaviors are modeled. They become models for behavior of the entire workforce. But they also determine if all your grandiose ideas as the leaders, as HR, if they're going to come to fruition. Will they live into that vision, those values? Will they? And if they don't, then all of this is for naught, right? So you have to make sure you have the right leaders on board to move the dial and the culture that you want for the future. And I work with a lot of clients. We have worked with dozens of clients over the past 3 months, right? So I don't take this lightly. Culture change is not easy, right? It's like, for me, weight loss. Good God, I'm hungry, right? And I gotta fight through those hunger pangs on a daily basis. But it's not easy. It may look easy on the back end, but you put a lot of energy and a lot of kinetic psychic energy into making that thing move forward. The same thing with your culture, right? So I don't want you to just seem like, oh, it's super easy. Just move this person, move that person, do this thing. No, these are human beings that you're requiring to change behavior, that you're having to make really difficult, life-altering decisions on if they stay or if they go in an economy that is not ripe for the picking. Like, it's not easy to go out there and find a new job. But as the people who are in charge of making sure your company survives and that the people inside your company have a fighting chance of continuing to have, a living wage, it's important for you to make the hard calls, right? And be very thoughtful. Right. So now is the time for you to focus on if your leadership is effective or not, because ineffective leadership is expensive, right? Leaders are usually your most highly paid folks in your organization. And it's exhausting if they're ineffective because it becomes somebody else's job. Come on now, jump in the chat if you've ever seen managers that have perhaps not been very effective, management that has perhaps not been able to, maybe really good practitioners, but not really good with people management. We need them to be both good practitioners and good with people. And that requires us to either coach them up or help transition them out with dignity and respect. Worst case scenario is that they're transitioning out, but there should never be a point where you're saying, well, we just have to allow this person to not be an effective leader and cause harm to our workforce and or our business because we don't want to have those difficult conversations. Let's go to the next one. So that was the culture piece. Culture is the bedrock of this, being responsive to the crisis that we're in, the realities of the crisis that we're in, we'll be in this situation for the immediate future, right? For the near future. Is that fair to say, John? For the near future, we're going to be in this COVID situation.
You can count on it through at least the end of 2021.
Man, you ain't have to say that, John. Yowza. Okay, so you heard it. You heard it from the economist group themselves. So financial solvency, that's a great segue. Are you at a place financially to be able to ride this storm and not go out of business, right? So in our work in workplace change, we worked with many companies to help them get prepared for their PPP, payroll, paycheck protection program, to get the loan, the forgivable loan. And many of our clients got this loan. And that loan is going to run out within 10 weeks. Most of our clients are going to be, PPP will have exhausted itself by the end of June. And I'm looking this way, my calendars, my big calendar of the world is over here. So most people are going to run out of PPP money in June, in a series of weeks. Okay. many of the clients that, some didn't, but many of my clients, our clients, they held on to their workforce, and they sustained their current business model and practices, even though they saw without a shadow of doubt that the business was changing, the demand, there were changes in consumer demands, and that there was a change in workflow. Like, they saw this happening. And yet they said, well, we have the PPP money, we can sustain people for 10 weeks, and then we'll probably be able to ride this wave and get to the other side of it, and then, business as usual. Well, that's likely not going to be the case. It's not going to be a few months, gang, right? And so let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about, the realities, of this. PPP is running out. Employers are finding themselves back in a similar position that they were in March 13th, right? Where they're like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do with this workforce? So layoffs and furloughs are always kind of a temporary fix. But now is the time for us to start thinking about long-term reconfigurations of teams. What is the new design of our business? How are we going to survive this storm if the trend lines continue to look like what John just presented to us? And I believe John. I've known John for almost a decade. You know what? His projections have been kind of right. I've been thinking about asking him for lotto numbers. Like, that's how accurate John is. All right. So John is saying through 2021, it's 2020 right now. Just a reminder. John is saying through 2021, gang, how are we going to reconfigure our teams to be responsive so that at the end of this, your company still survives? This is super hard. This is especially hard if you have made cuts, if you already made cuts and furloughed your workforce early on, right? To even imagine going and doing another cut is hard to imagine. Trust me, I understand, because we worked with dozens of companies to have those very hard initial conversations. Folks are reluctant to have those conversations. I'm telling this group and the folks who will, we have over 100 people who registered for the webinar today. We're going to send this video out. I am imploring you to start talking about the long-term plans, permanent, semi-permanent plans to respond to the crisis that we're in. So my question for you is, does your current staffing model work for your new business reality? If your response to that question, right, is maybe, I don't know, not right now, but, or no, then it's time to start planning today. You are behind the ball. Let's go. Let's get at it. Next slide. All right. And so the third part of this conversation today is that I want for us to focus on, in order for you to kind of be responsive to the financial realities, and when I talk about finances, I'm talking about workforce, which is most people's most expensive asset, right? I can't tell you about the pork that you're going to need to make the sandwiches that you make, or your beef, or the cotton you need to make really awesome outfits, or the metals, the precious metal. I can't tell you about that. That's not my lane. But what I do know is that the workforce dynamics, the staffing configurations have to be reimagined right now. Because I want you to win, right? I want you to be around at the end of this. So my question for you from an organizational design standpoint is, are you trying to get back to normal, right? And was normal really working for folks? For whom was normal working, right? That's my question for you. Let's keep going. So when considering organizational culture and financial solvency, we must consider the organizational design. Below are the questions I want you to ask yourselves about your organizational design. And these are some of the questions, these are just a few of the questions that we ask our clients when they're basically trying to figure out how to afford this workforce and they need to kind of re-plan how things are put together. I ask, is your organization too flat? They say, well, what do you mean by too flat? Are there bottlenecks that are impediments to you being able to get the work done? Because that may mean that you need another person over here making some decisions, who has some authority to make some decisions. Are you too hierarchical? Are there too many layers and you're too matrixed, right? Are there too many layers to your organization, which causes silos, which arguably are just as harmful as bottlenecks, right? Oh, we don't talk to that group. Well, that's that group's job. You know, well, let's see if we can get a meeting on the schedule 4 weeks from now to talk about that thing that we should be able to talk about today, right? Is it are there too many layers? Question number 2, are you too top heavy? Meaning too much management. Look, man, I know that these conversations are challenging. I am not saying this lightly. I'm saying these are the questions you've got to ask yourself. Management is very expensive. Do you have enough? Do you have too much? Difficult discussions to have, right? Maybe you have furloughed your management team, brought them down to 50%. How has that worked? Has it been more effective? That may be an indication that you maybe had too much, right? Especially for the current reality that we're a part of. I'm not saying that that is the fact of the matter, but it may be. Are there lines of business that are too costly to maintain, meaning they don't even pay for themselves anymore? You're doing this thing because you've always done this thing, but you're hemorrhaging money by continuing to do this thing because you've got a whole staff over here. You don't have that kind of demand coming from the marketplace anymore. Can you maintain it, or do you have to narrow it down? Questions for you to ask that only you and your organization can answer. And then the fourth one that I wanted to throw out here is your workload equitable? Are there full-time folks who are working 40 to 60 hours a week? I mean, folks are talking about COVID burnout, right? You just work and you work and you work. Like all the days, I mean, what is today? I don't even know. Yes, I do. It's a 3-day weekend today, right? But folks are feeling like Monday feels like Thursday feels, that is fatigue. That is a person who feels like they never stop working. While other folks are working 25, 30 hours a week. This is happening in some ecosystems. And sometimes there's an assumption that it's happening, like that person's not working as hard as me, which is also just as impactful and unhealthy, right? So you have to take some time, have your HR pro, have your management come around a Zoom table, right? A virtual table, and talk about what are the workloads. Have we furloughed appropriately? The beauty about a furlough is that you get to tinker with the timing, not too much because that is traumatic for folks, but a little bit to be responsive to the demands, the client consumer demands that you have. Let's go to the next slide. How are we doing on time? I'm doing great on time. Okay, if I do say so myself. All right, so things to consider. Now that we've asked you these questions, here are the things that I want you to consider. The actions you should take around management. Leaders should be assessed to determine if you have the right management structure, and if you have the right people in your organization to move your culture to the next place, right? Organizational design isn't just, about the boxes that are there. It's about the names in those boxes as well. Can they effectively lead your team to the next iteration? But I want to caution you. Don't rely on your gut for this analysis. Your gut is riddled with bias. Use data. I mean, John is like a data magician. I'm sure he can figure out something to whip up for you. Call him. Call ECONorthwest, right? Call Workplace Change. But use data, because when you don't use data, you get into some things like, and we've talked about this in previous webinars, who you like more, who needs more money from your perspective, like who can afford to be cut, who cannot afford to be cut. These are all bad practices, okay, gang? And then, as you're thinking about organizational design, think about the staff, the teams, and the departments. People say they love change, but I'm gonna get close to the camera. They don't. In my line of work, I am certain most human beings do not love change. Change is very hard for people. So when you're thinking about merging teams or changing teams or reducing teams, eliminating teams, this is hard, right? You have to think about the personalities, or at least that's where you start. You think about the complicated relationships that have been established over sometimes decades, right? Two individuals don't really see eye to eye, but you know in your heart that the best case scenario is to merge those two teams, because there's no reason why marketing and communication right now should be separate. Marketing and communication should be together, but the marketing director and the communications director, no one wants to become the manager, or they never got along. That's why you separated it 2 decades ago. Can you afford to allow those personalities and internal politics to impact your business right now? Can you afford that? That's my question for you. And then also making some of these calls, it's hard because of the relationship. Like you have relationships with people, you feel guilty. You feel like, oh my gosh, I've got to cut someone. These people, you know, these people have mortgages and rents and babies to take care of. These are all true statements. But if your company doesn't survive, then everybody's going to be in unemployment anyway. You got to make these calls right now. And you have to do it with care, and you have to do it thoughtfully, and you have to do it before it gets so bad that you can't give people severance packages and you can't keep people on health insurance because you haven't made these calls now. Okay, and I'm seeing this happen with clients. I'm seeing clients basically say, I got one more payroll in me, and then everybody's got to go. We are having these conversations right now. And had that person, had that organization, had that company perhaps done some cuts on the front end, they may actually have been able to weather this storm a little bit better. But because they kept 100% of people on board in the current way that it was structured, it didn't work out. All right, let's go to the next slide. So in conclusion, now is the time for a business model reboot. Boeing CEO shared that he believed that one major U.S. airline is going to go out of business during this crisis. Now, the airlines did not like that he said that, but he did. I mean, it was all over the news for a little while there. Open Table CEO projected that at least 25% of all restaurants in the United States of America will go out of business. The state of Oregon has a $3 billion shortfall and is asking all agencies to cut their budgets by 25%. I give you this information because I want you to see the severity. This isn't going away overnight, right? Now is the time for your business model to be rebooted. Now is also the time for you to practice transparent and honest communication. You need your workforce to believe in you and to fight for you. And there's a humane way to reduce staff. There's a humane way to consolidate teams. There's a systematic way to make these decisions and not disproportionately impact certain communities of people or certain departments or teams. There's a way to do this with integrity and thoughtfulness. And then now is the time to double down on consistently holding staff and leaders accountable for outcomes and behaviors. Most companies can no longer afford to have staff and execs who are not nimble and who are opposed to change. Now is not the time. Now is not the time. And most can no longer afford to have unresolved conflict, negative people. Like, you know who I'm talking about. Jump in the chat if you do, right? Negative people who are just like, oh, you woke up mad? Like, just every day. Okay. That's not healthy, right? That's not healthy, especially in high stress environments. People with poor attitudes, people who are gossiping and stoking fires to get people fired up. And people who have demonstrated that they cannot lead or do their assigned works. Now is the time to address those matters because, times are tough. All right. So let's go to the last slide. That was the last slide. So you need to be the change. Again, now is the time for us to have these conversations, and I want to open it up to the chat in our final couple minutes. Katie, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yeah, we have a few. I'm going to go back a bit to a question from Nicola for John. Says, appreciate the frankness. I believe there are some opportunities for growth. Wondering what John's thoughts are on which or what sectors may bounce back.
Yeah, and a lot of sectors are going to bounce back. Everybody's going to bounce back some. It really is leisure, hospitality, and anything to do with tourism that's going to struggle the most. They'll be in better shape than they are at this moment, but they're not going to get back to where they were January, February. If I had to go to the strongest bouncing back, it's going to be the healthcare sector, dental, those kinds of things that have good sort of procedures and people trust when they go into the facilities. And then for every, hopefully construction, manufacturing, et cetera, but now all of that's kind of getting tied into the big global economy. And everything's a little bit slower, all by itself now, caused by the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I hear HR is going to bounce back. I heard that whole industry.
Awesome.
We're going to be all right, John.
HR is going to be busy. Yeah.
This is true. And accountants. Katie?
Yeah, we have another question directed toward John, but I'm going to throw it to both of you. What strategies and policies should we consider pursuing if we have the amount of unemployment projected? What new roles need to be developed? And this is from Jay.
So I'll take a first swing at that. It's, we will have an unprecedented, precedented from the Great Depression in terms of the share of people who are on the sidelines. We're going to have to think very deep and hard about how we give opportunities for people to find purpose and to train and maybe have temporary work options government supported during this period. We are not used to unemployment in the teens, and just a lot of people who have come out of leisure hospitality sector and are not going to see many options. They're going to need something to do other than collect unemployment checks.
Absolutely. And the gig economy is very helpful in this regard. What we have shared with folks is, if you do have to do reductions in your workforce, there are opportunities for you to bring people back in a contract capacity. So it doesn't have to be forever. It doesn't have to be, farewell, sayonara. It can be, we can't afford to keep you in this capacity. You're still eligible to draw down unemployment, and you can still come back in a contractor capacity because we need your skill set, but we can't afford it at that level. So we just have to be creative in how we deploy our workforce, how we utilize the gig economy, and how we think about integrating folks who are currently seeking employment into current organizations that have the capacity, that have the financial capacity especially, and integrating them into your ecosystem. There's some creative ways. Were there any other questions, Katie?
I'm just going to throw one more thought from Tina, if you guys would like to weigh in. I'd like to figure out how to find respect for people in positions that I don't agree with them having.
Yeah. So, Tina, man, finding respect for folks that you don't feel have respect for you. Is that the question? I mean, that's how I'm interpreting the question. Katie, is that how you interpreted the question? Tina, am I interpreting the question correctly? Yeah, sure, she said. So Tina, here's the thing. Communication is a two-way street, right? So you have to give a person an opportunity to know that they are having this impact on you. This is not presuming that you haven't, but you have to at least give them that opportunity. And then if they don't listen, up level it. Either go to human resources or go to their manager to say, this is how this is impacting me, and this is not okay from my perspective, and ask for support. But my recommendation is to always start by having the conversation with the individual for whom you don't feel drawn to, and you don't feel is having respect for you. That's what I would say. All right. So, hey, gang, we're 5 minutes over time. I'm a big proponent of start on time, end on time. I want you to have a beautiful Memorial Day. John Topogna from ECONorthwest. I want to thank you so much for joining us. The information that you have is so valuable. And I want you to continue to spread the gospel of the realities of the COVID crisis, and it's not going away tomorrow. Hopefully this was valuable to folks. We'll send the deck, we'll send the link to the webinar out to you, and we want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.